The Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. Introduction. Remember this, the stories remain. Even after I tell you about the Grimm brothers and about Arthur Rackham, even after I pop some bubbles and disenchant some lives, even then, the stories remain. If you forget everything else I tell you, remember this. First, you need to understand that the Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm, were not simply wandering around Germany trying to collect the best stories they could from the peasantry. What they were doing had several purposes, much higher or lower than that. They were not the kind of folktale collectors we know today. Indeed, again and again, they revised the stories they collected, changing them to match their vision of a true Germanic utopia where things end happily ever after. The Grimms actually wanted to showcase German stories so as to glorify the greatness of the German popular tradition. As Professor Jack Zipes, a translator of the complete fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, has put it. And further, they believed that by collecting German stories and folklore, by studying German language and customs, they would be able to have a huge and moral impact on the German people and, from there, the world. Of course, if we think about how the 19th century utopian vision became corrupted by the Nazis less than 100 years later, we have to shudder. About the Grimms. The Grimms came from a solidly middle-class background. They had servants to help with the household chores. Their father was a prosperous lawyer turned district magistrate. Their mother, the daughter of a castle councilman. There were 9 children, though only 6 survived into adulthood. Of the survivors, Jacob was the oldest and Wilhelm was next. They are the two who would eventually become known as the Brothers Grimm. When Jacob was 11 and Wilhelm 10, their father caught pneumonia and died. Within weeks, the family had to move out of their idyllic country house, dismiss most of the servants, and live much more frugally. Only loans from their Zimmer grandfather and Zimmer aunt helped keep them afloat. Jacob was now the head of the household. Prone to depression, the Grimm's mother was not much help. Luckily, Jacob and Wilhelm were smart, hard-working students. At the Lyceum, the local high school, Jacob and Wilhelm shared the same room, desk, and bed, studying 12 hours a day. It was almost as if they had to prove themselves the best pupils. At 13 months apart, they were always best friends and never rivals. In fact, they made a promise to one another when they were 20 and 19 respectively, to always remain close. Alas, while they were at school, disaster struck again. Their grandfather died suddenly, and the family was left without his monetary support. During the 4 years at school, Jacob became stronger, both physically and health-wise. But poor Wilhelm suffered through attacks of scarlet fever and asthma, so much so that he had to postpone entering the university for half a year. Indeed, he would be an invalid on and off for the rest of his life. Still, both boys managed, through adversity and ill health, to graduate as head scholar in their respective classes. However, because their social standing was no longer considered high enough to study law at the university, they had to get special dispensations to go there, paying their own way instead of receiving a stipend, as did many of the already wealthy young scholars there. How did this come down in the world change the Grimm boys? Zipes thinks it had a lot to do with their idealization of the common folk. Now they began to identify with the hard-working people, for they were of them, not just looking at them from above. When Jacob went off to the university, it was the first time the boys had been separated. He planned on becoming a lawyer like his father, but studied law out of a sense of duty, not because he loved it. One of his instructors, a young scholar named Savny, became his lifelong friend. By allowing Jacob to use his rather extensive personal library, Savny introduced Jacob to medieval manuscripts full of stories. He also introduced Jacob to his brother-in-law, Clemens Brentano, a poet and collector of folklore, folk songs, and folk tales. It is not an exaggeration to say that Savny changed Jacob Grimm's life. When Wilhelm, who'd been confined to bed for half a year with asthma, finally followed his brother to the university, he, too, fell under the spell of Savny and Brentano. But more important, both boys became enchanted by romantic literature, poetry, and especially Old German literature, much more so than the law. In January 1805, Savny was in Paris researching a book on Roman law. He wrote to Jacob asking him to come and help. While there, Jacob found time to explore German medieval manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. He would remain in Paris for 9 months, and those studies became the pattern for his life's work. But money was still very tight for the Grimms, and instead of finishing his studies, Jacob found work in a mind-numbing job in the War College in Kassel. Meanwhile, Wilhelm got his law degree, but then could not find a position. When their beloved mother died suddenly at the age of 52, the brothers Grimm had to take over the complete care of their younger siblings on very little money and with a heavy burden of sadness. However, in 1808, things finally began to look up. Jacob secured a position as director of the Westphalian King's private library. It was not a difficult job, and Jacob had plenty of time to pursue his own studies in folklore and folk tales. When the king unexpectedly appointed him auditor of the Council of State, Jacob was given such a big raise that, for the first time in years, the family no longer had any money woes. All this didn't make for a perfect year. Wilhelm's health took a turn for the worse, and no longer able to take a paying job, he began to study Norse literature on his own, which ironically established his reputation as a scholar. So there, the brothers Grimm were, both studying folklore and ancient literature, making a small name for themselves as scholars, getting published in minor ways. They taught themselves a number of languages, including Old English, Old Norse, Old Danish, Old High German, and even some Sanskrit, so they could read and understand the stories that they were studying in the original. This was a far cry from the work as lawyers which their mother had envisioned. Furthermore, because the part of Germany where they were living was now occupied by the French, they dreamed of past German glory. About the stories. The Grimm brothers' writing didn't begin with German folk tales. Jacob wrote an essay about the old German troubadour tradition, the Metzingers. Wilhelm worked on a book of Danish folk and fairy tales. Jacob authored the groundbreaking The History of the German Language. They did translations and studies and essays as well as medieval research. Wilhelm edited and translated old Danish heroic songs, ballads, and fairy tales, and worked on Scottish songs. Both brothers sent in pieces for Brentano and Arnhem's Book of Old Songs, The Boy's Wonderhorn, as well as translations of the Icelandic Edda. However, 3 things set the Grimm brothers on the road to bestsellerdom. First was the overwhelming success of The Boy's Wonderhorn. Second was the publication of Philip Otto Rune's 2 German tales, The Fisherman and His Wife, and The Juniper Tree. The Fisherman's story is about the consequences of greed, a tale that is both funny and pointed. The Juniper Tree is a horrific story of family dynamics. A letter from Rune that accompanied the publication of the tales urged readers to collect more such stories. This plea resonated with the Grimms. Third, their sometime friend Brentano was working on more collections of fairy and folk tales, but the Grimms felt he played too fast and loose with the translations, so they decided to create a collection of their own. They began the work in 1806. Christmas of 1812 saw the first publication of Children's and Household Tales, a book that contained both stories and scholarly annotations because it was never envisioned as a book for children. Rather, as Zipf says, the book was simply part of their grand project to excavate the natural poetry of the German people. How did they collect their stories? That is the big question. The truth has only come to light in recent years. Yes, they did write down stories from the mouths of storytellers, but the majority of these tellers were well-born, often aristocratic tellers, not German peasants who probably heard some of their stories from the lower classes, from their nannies, nursemaids, and servants. Note, the nannies, nursemaids, and servants were not invited to tell tales to the Grimms. It's clear, too, that some of the stories came from written sources. Furthermore, many of the tellers were not German at all, but rather French Huguenots who'd escaped from France where they'd been persecuted. Other tales the Grimms collected directly from old manuscripts. The German peasant tradition was but a small blip on the Grimms' radar screen, if there at all. The Grimms often invited the tellers, mostly women, to their home, where they would speak the stories aloud. After 1 or more recitations, the brothers would take notes. In fact, Wilhelm later married one of these educated tellers, Dorschen Wild, and they had 3 children. Jacob never married. In the brothers' notes were hundreds of stories, but not all were finished. Some remained in fragments or without endings. Many are variant versions of the printed tales, but in the published stories we can see how the Grimms have smoothed out, revised, and rewritten the stories to make them livelier, more sequential, and resonantly moral. These revisions reinforce motives and draw characters more clearly. In other words, they make the stories more literary than word of mouth. They also got rid of erotic elements that might offend their mostly middle-class audience. And from the 1819 edition on, Wilhelm purposefully edited the stories to make them appropriate for children. These days, proper folklorists would resist such tinkering with stories. But popularizers, oral tellers as well as authors of children's books, movie makers, and the like, have always known that folk tales change with the teller and the times. The stories the Grimms chose also resonated soundly with their own personal beliefs. The heroes and heroines are all honest, kind, hard-working, faithful, industrious, and follow the rules. Men and boys are valued over the women and girls. Being a good wife and mother is what the females aspire to, and bad mothers, stepmothers as they are called, are dealt with ruthlessly, much more so than bad fathers. The first volume of children's and household tales was not an immediate success, nor was the second, edited for the most part by Wilhelm, which came out in 1819. But eventually, the Grimms went from being scholars, translators, and essayists to best-selling authors. In fact, children's and household tales was to become, next to the Bible, the most widely read book in Germany. About Arthur Rackham. This edition of Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales includes what many believe to be the finest illustrations done for the book. They are by the British illustrator Arthur Rackham. The grace and grotesque pictures, as E.V. Lucas has called his work, are immediately recognizable. Gnarled trees, wizened and wrinkled creatures of old fairy, translucent fairy wings like miniature stained glass, lustrous faces of young heroes and heroines, all done in a subtle palette, where earth tones dominate. Born in 1867, Arthur Rackham was the second surviving child of a modestly middle-class London family. Even young, he was an artist, sneaking paper and pencil into bed at night, where he would work until it became too dark to draw any more. One of his most treasured possessions was an illustrated Arabian Nights, another, which he called My Faithful Friend, a shilling paint box. Spotting his talent early, his parents took him on trips to the British Museum and the National History Museum, where he sketched prolifically. Perhaps even more defining for Arthur's art, the family lived across the street from a great old house, now quite ruined, with a 3.5-acre garden of neglected old specimen trees from around the world. As he grew up, Arthur spent a great deal of time there, rambling around in the overgrown garden, sketching. He left regular school at age 16 and attended night studies at Lambeth School of Art. During the day, he worked in an insurance company as a clerk. He also started showing his work at the Royal Academy summer exhibitions. At the same time, he began to send out illustrations to some of the many magazines flourishing in the London area, starting what would eventually be a stunning career. But at the beginning, his was a piecemeal life. Eventually, he quit the insurance business and joined the staff of a newspaper. With his pen and paints, he was to the Pall Mall budget what later photojournalists would be. His sketches were spirited, lively, often sharp in their observations of events. From there, he went to a larger and more progressive paper, the Westminster Budget, and got his first job illustrating a book. Arthur was 30 in 1897, still eking out a living doing picture journalism, painting landscapes and portraits, and occasionally illustrating some books. As Rackham himself said, "For many years I was getting the barest living from my profession and having to do much distasteful hack work." But side by side with the hack work, he was creating some marvelous books. Between 1893 and 1900, he illustrated, among a number of other books, Le Morte d'Arthur, Rip Van Winkle, and Gulliver's Travels. In 1900, he made his first attempt at illustrating Grimm's fairy tales. His illustrations for these books presaged his greatest work, all finally done in full color, and all in the area of fantasy and the fantastic. What is it that makes Rackham's illustrations so prized? First and foremost, he was an amazing draftsman. His line is impeccable, his composition draws the eye, but even more, his characters pulse with life. He has set these characters either in natural backgrounds that are lush and readily identifiable, or within architectures that are equally strong and equally memorable. He has an inherent sense of both decoration and drama. Indeed, he was eventually known as both the Goblin Master and court painter to King Oberon and Queen Titania, the names, of course, of the king and queen of fairy. The sad thing is that at the end of his successful career, he wrote in his journal about art that the lesser aim was book illustration, and the more imperatively urgent was painting in oils, as if he were bemoaning the fact that most of his life had been misspent. Jane Yolen. Jane Yolen is the author of nearly 300 books of folklore, fantasy, and science fiction, including books for young readers. Her many awards and honors include the Caldecott Medal and the World Fantasy Award. That is the introduction to the Grimm's complete fairy tales. One of his most treasured possessions